When the HOA framed me for arson after my cabin fire, they had no idea I controlled the judge's verdict, and their smug confidence was about to become their biggest mistake. I still remember the exact moment my world flipped upside down. I was standing in the ashes of what used to be my grandfather's cabin, still smelling the smoke that had consumed 40 years of family memories, when Margaret Chen from the Pinewood Hills HOA walked up with a manila envelope and that serpent smile of hers. "So sorry about your little accident, David," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Though I suppose we all saw this coming." The envelope felt heavy in my trembling hands. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Me near the cabin, the night before the fire. A gas can in my truck. Receipts for accelerants I'd supposedly purchased. Insurance papers highlighting the policy I'd taken out just 6 months earlier. What the hell is this? My voice cracked like I was 16 again. Margaret's smile widened. Evidence. The fire department will be very interested to see these. Along with witness statements from 3 neighbors who saw you acting suspicious that night. My stomach dropped into my boots. 3 witnesses? I knew exactly which 3 she meant, the same HOA board members who'd been trying to force me off this property for the last 2 years. You can't be serious. You're actually going to frame you for arson? She finished my sentence like she was discussing the weather. Oh, David, we're not framing anyone. We're simply presenting the truth as we see it. The truth that you burned down your own cabin to collect insurance money and spite this community. The blood drained from my face as the full scope of their plan hit me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This wasn't another ridiculous fine or violation notice. They were trying to destroy my entire life. The district attorney is expecting these photos tomorrow morning, Margaret continued, her voice getting colder with each word. Along with a formal complaint signed by 12 concerned neighbors. You know what arson carries in the state? 5 to 20 years. 20 years. The number echoed in my skull like a death sentence. I'd be 64 when I got out. My career, my reputation, my future, all of it would be gone. And for what? Because I refused to tear down a cabin that had been in my family since before their precious HOA even existed? You won't get away with this, I whispered, but even I could hear how hollow it sounded. Margaret laughed, actually laughed. Oh, but we will. You see, David, you made one crucial mistake. You thought you could fight us. You thought your little property rights and your grandfather's legacy meant something? But this is our community now. Our rules. Our judge. Our judge. The words sent ice through my veins. Judge Morrison has been very clear about property maintenance violations in this district, she continued. Very tough on insurance fraud too, especially when it involves someone with your financial difficulties. Financial difficulties. They'd been watching my bank accounts? My loan applications? How deep did this conspiracy go? As Margaret walked away, her heels clicking against the charred concrete like a countdown timer, one thought burned through my panic, brighter than the fire that had consumed my cabin. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Because while Margaret Chen and her HOA cronies had been busy fabricating evidence and bribing witnesses, they'd made one fundamental error in their research. They knew about Judge Morrison's tough stance on property violations. They knew about his friendship with several HOA board members. They even knew about his reputation for harsh sentences. But they didn't know about his daughter. They didn't know that Judge Morrison's youngest daughter, Emma, was my law school study partner, my closest friend, and the woman who'd been quietly helping me navigate property law for the past 3 years. They didn't know that every family barbecue, every holiday dinner, every casual conversation I'd had with Judge Morrison had been building something Margaret could never have anticipated. They thought they'd bought themselves a judge. But I'd already earned myself a family. And now, standing in the ruins of my grandfather's dream, holding their pathetic frame job in my hands, I realized something that made me smile for the first time in days. This wasn't the end of my story. This was just the beginning of theirs. That cabin wasn't just wood and nails to me, it was the last piece of my grandfather I had left, and the HOA knew exactly how to hurt me where it mattered most. Grandpa Pete built that place with his own hands in 1982, back when Pinewood Hills was nothing but forest and farmland. No HOA, no property restrictions, just a man and his dream of having somewhere quiet to think. He'd spend every weekend there, teaching me how to fish in Miller's Creek, how to identify bird calls, how to build things that would last. David, he'd say, his weathered hands guiding mine as we replaced a deckboard, property isn't just about ownership. It's about legacy, about leaving something better than you found it. When he passed 5 years ago, that cabin became my sanctuary. Every Friday night, I'd drive the hour from downtown to escape the noise of my marketing job, the pressure of city life, the endless demands of a world that never stopped moving. I'd sit on that porch he'd built, listening to the creek, feeling connected to something real. That's when the HOA started circling like vultures. It began innocently enough. Margaret Chen knocked on my door one Saturday morning with a clipboard and that practiced smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood. We just wanted you to know about our community standards." Community standards. The cabin that had stood peacefully for 40 years was suddenly a structure that diminishes property values. The garden my grandfather had lovingly maintained was now an unregulated landscaping issue. The gravel driveway that had never bothered anyone was suddenly a surface material violation. The first fine was $50. Minor roofing repair needed, the notice said. I ignored it. The cabin roof was solid. Grandpa Pete had rebuilt it himself just 3 years before he died. The second fine was $200. Exterior paint not in compliance with community palette. I laughed out loud reading that one. The cabin was natural wood stain, exactly like it had been for 4 decades. By month 6, the fines were coming weekly. $800 for improper mailbox placement. $600 for unauthorized deck modifications. $1,200 for landscaping maintenance failures. This is insane, I told my neighbor Jim, who'd lived there since the 80s. They're making up violations that don't even exist. Jim looked around nervously before leaning closer. Dave, you need to understand something. Margaret and her crew, they've been trying to develop this whole section for 2 years. Your cabin sits right in the middle of where they want to build their luxury condos. My blood went cold. They can't force me to sell. They can't, Jim agreed. But they can make your life hell until you want to. That's when the harassment escalated. Surprise inspections every week. Citations for violations I'd supposedly committed but hadn't. Anonymous complaints to the county about suspicious activity at my property. The insurance policy Margaret mentioned? I'd been forced to increase it after they reported my cabin as a fire hazard to my insurance company. The accelerants she claimed I'd bought? Cleaning supplies for the constant deep cleaning I had to do before their weekly inspections. Every photo, every receipt, every piece of their evidence they'd been building this frame job for months, twisting my desperate attempts to comply with their manufactured violations into proof of criminal intent. The night before the fire, I'd been there until midnight, scrubbing the deck with industrial cleaner because Margaret had threatened another surface contamination fine. I'd bought extra cleaning supplies, worked in my truck's headlights, done everything they'd demanded. And they'd photographed every second of it. But here's what Margaret and her board of vultures didn't understand. That cabin represented more than just my grandfather's legacy. It represented every weekend he'd spent teaching me about integrity. Every conversation about standing up for what's right. Every lesson about never letting bullies win just because they have more power. A man's character, Grandpa Pete used to say, isn't measured by how he acts when everyone's watching. It's measured by what he does when he thinks nobody will ever know. Well, Margaret was about to learn that somebody had been watching all along. Because while she'd been busy orchestrating her elaborate frame job, documenting my every move, building her case piece by piece, she'd forgotten one crucial detail. I wasn't just some random property owner she could steamroll. I was Judge Morrison's daughter's best friend. I'd been in his home hundreds of times. I'd sat at his dinner table, heard his war stories from the bench, listened to his frustrations about corrupt HOAs and frivolous lawsuits. And most importantly, I'd earned something Margaret's money could never buy, his respect. The fire had taken my grandfather's cabin, but it hadn't taken his lessons. It hadn't taken the connections I'd built, or the truth I knew. Margaret thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. She was about to discover she'd been wrong about everything. The HOA board meeting felt like a tribunal, with Margaret Chen and her cronies arranged behind their oak table like judges passing sentence on my life. "Thank you for coming, David," Margaret said, her voice echoing in the community center's sterile conference room. "Though I suppose you didn't have much choice." I looked around the room at the 5 board members who'd decided my fate before I'd even walked through the door. Margaret at the center, flanked by Bob Harrison, a retired cop with dead eyes and a grudge against anyone under 60. To her left sat Sandra Mills, the neighborhood gossip who treated HOA violations like personal vendettas. The other two, Frank Chen, Margaret's husband, naturally, and Patricia Wong, might as well have been cardboard cutouts for all the independent thinking they contributed. "Let's get straight to business," Margaret continued, sliding a thick folder across the table. "We've compiled substantial evidence of your insurance fraud and arson." My hands shook as I opened the folder. The photos were even more damning than I'd expected. Me carrying gas cans. Me working late at the cabin. Me meeting with insurance adjusters. Every innocent action twisted into something sinister through their lens. "This is unbelievable," I said, my voice barely steady. "You've been stalking me for months." Bob Harrison leaned forward, his cop instincts kicking in. "Documenting suspicious behavior isn't stalking, son. It's community safety." "Suspicious behavior?" I slammed the folder shut. "I was cleaning my property. I was following your ridiculous violation notices to the letter." "Were you?" Margaret's smile was pure venom. "Because our records show you've been consistently non-compliant, consistently argumentative, consistently resistant to community standards." She pulled out another folder, this one twice as thick. 47 separate violations in 18 months. 47 opportunities to do the right thing. Instead, you chose defiance. I felt the walls closing in. Every fine I'd protested, every violation I'd challenged, every moment I'd stood up for my grandfather's property, they'd twisted it all into a narrative of rebellion and fraud. "The insurance policy you increased 6 months ago," Sandra chimed in, her voice sharp with accusation. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "You forced me to increase it." I shot back. "You reported my cabin as a fire hazard." "Did we?" Margaret flipped through her papers with theatrical precision. "I don't see any record of that. Do you, Bob?" Bob shook his head slowly. "No record at all." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. They'd scrubbed their own paper trail while building mine. Every phone call, every report, every threat, it had all disappeared into the administrative black hole of HOA bureaucracy. "You can't seriously think anyone will believe this," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Judge Morrison knows me. He knows my character." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Margaret started laughing, a cold, calculated sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, David. Sweet, naive David." She leaned back in her chair like a cat with a cornered mouse. Judge Morrison is a dear friend of this community. He's seen what property neglect can do to neighborhood values. He's very sympathetic to HOA concerns. Frank Chen spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge had dinner at our house last month. Lovely evening. We discussed the growing problem of insurance fraud in residential areas. My stomach dropped. They'd been working Judge Morrison too, poisoning the well before I even knew I was drowning. Besides, Margaret continued, her confidence growing with every word, what exactly do you think you can tell him? That you're innocent? That this is all some elaborate conspiracy? She gestured to the mountain of evidence. The photos don't lie, David. The timeline doesn't lie. Your financial desperation doesn't lie. Patricia Wong finally piped up, her voice trembling with fake concern. We really didn't want it to come to this. If you'd just sold the property when we first approached you, none of this would have been necessary. There it was. The confession I'd been waiting for, delivered with such casual cruelty that it took my breath away. So you admit it? I whispered. You admit this is all about forcing me to sell. Margaret's mask didn't slip for even a second. I admit nothing except our duty to protect this community from fraudulent insurance claims and dangerous property owners. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. The district attorney will receive our full report tomorrow morning. I suggest you use tonight to call a lawyer. You're going to need one. As I walked toward the door, my legs feeling like concrete, Bob Harrison called after me. One piece of advice, son. Plea bargains look a lot better than fighting charges you can't win. I turned back to face them, these 5 people who decided to destroy my life over a piece of property they wanted for themselves. Their faces showed no remorse, no doubt, no hint that they understood the magnitude of what they were doing. You have no idea what you've started, I said quietly. Margaret's smile widened. Oh, but we do. We started it months ago. And now, finally, we're finishing it. Walking out into the parking lot, I felt the weight of their certainty pressing down on me like a tombstone. They had evidence. They had witnesses. They had Judge Morrison's ear and the district attorney's attention. But they didn't have the whole story. And tomorrow, they were going to learn the difference. The next 72 hours felt like watching my life disintegrate in slow motion, with every attempt to fight back crumbling in my hands like ash. My first call was to Jake Morrison, my old college buddy, who'd become a decent defense attorney. I figured if anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it would be someone who knew me personally. Dave, I'm going to be straight with you, Jake said, after reviewing the HOA's evidence packet. This looks bad. Really bad. The timeline, the photos, the insurance angle, any prosecutor would see this as a slam dunk. I paced my apartment, phone pressed against my ear. But you know me, Jake. You know I'd never do something like this. What I know doesn't matter in court. What matters is what 12 strangers will think when they see you carrying gas cans the night before your cabin mysteriously burns down. My second attempt was even more devastating. I hired a private investigator to look into the HOA's claims, thinking maybe I could find holes in their story. 3 days and $800 later, Mike Hendricks came back with worse news. They covered their tracks perfectly. Every witness statement is consistent. Every photo is time-stamped and authenticated. Hell, they even have video surveillance from the neighbor's security camera showing you at the property that night. Video? My heart stopped. What video? You didn't know? Mike looked genuinely surprised. Bob Harrison installed a camera system at his house 6 months ago. Captures the entire street, including your cabin's driveway. Shows you there until almost midnight, moving around with lights, carrying containers. The noose was tightening. Every innocent action, every moment I'd spent trying to satisfy their impossible demands, had been documented and weaponized against me. But the real knife twist came when I tried to gather character witnesses. I started with my neighbor's people who'd known me for years, who'd seen how much the cabin meant to me. Jim Patterson, who'd warned me about the HOA's development plans, suddenly became unavailable. "Sorry, Dave," his wife Linda said through a crack in the door. "Jim thinks it's best if we don't get involved. HOA matters can get complicated." Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who'd always waved when I drove past, pretended not to recognize me when I approached her in the grocery store. When I pressed, she whispered nervously, "They're saying you're dangerous, that you might burn down other properties too." One by one, my support network evaporated. People I'd considered friends suddenly had scheduling conflicts when I asked them to vouch for my character. Coworkers started treating me like a ticking time bomb. Even my boss called me into his office. "David, we need to discuss your situation," Mr. Garrison said, not meeting my eyes. "The company can't afford to be associated with criminal allegations." "I haven't been charged with anything yet," I protested. Yet being the operative word, "Look, take some unpaid leave. Let this blow over. If you're cleared, we'll talk about reinstatement." The isolation was suffocating, but what made it worse was watching the HOA's influence spread like a virus through the community. Margaret had turned my fight into their crusade, painting me as a dangerous criminal who threatened everyone's safety and property values. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, "Local man suspected in insurance fraud scheme." They didn't mention it was all allegations. They didn't mention the HOA's conflict of interest. They just presented Margaret's narrative as established fact. My lawyer's confidence crumbled further with each passing day. "Dave, I hate to say this, but maybe you should consider a plea deal. Insurance fraud carries serious time, but if you cooperate..." Cooperate with what? I didn't do anything. The evidence says otherwise. And juries. Juries don't like insurance fraud, especially when it involves arson. You could be looking at 15 years if this goes to trial. The walls were closing in from every direction. My savings were bleeding away on legal fees. My reputation was destroyed. My career was on hold. And every day that passed, Margaret's version of events became more entrenched in people's minds. But the final blow came when I learned about the district attorney's press conference. Standing next to Margaret and Bob Harrison, Patricia Wells announced her office would be aggressively pursuing charges against individuals who defraud insurance companies and endanger communities through arson. "This case represents everything wrong with insurance fraud," she declared, my arrest warrant practically written in her eyes. "We will not tolerate criminals who burn down their own property for financial gain." That night, sitting alone in my apartment with eviction notices and legal bills piling up around me, I felt the full weight of their machine crushing down on me. They'd thought of everything. Every angle, every witness, every possible defense. They'd neutralized it all before I even knew I was fighting. Margaret was right about one thing. They hadn't just started this months ago. They'd perfected it. But as I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, one thought kept echoing through my despair. They might have been planning this for months, but I'd been building something for years. Something they knew nothing about. Something that was about to change everything. That's when I realized I'd been playing their game instead of my own, and it was time to remember who I really was and what cards I'd been holding all along. The breakthrough came during what should have been my lowest moment. I was sitting in my car outside the courthouse, watching DA Wells and Margaret Chen pose for more photos, when my phone buzzed with a text from Emma Morrison. "Dad mentioned you're going through a rough patch. Coffee tomorrow? I might be able to help." Emma, Judge Morrison's daughter. My law school study partner. The woman who'd spent 3 years helping me understand property law, constitutional rights, and most importantly, courtroom strategy. We met at our old spot, a quiet cafe near the law school, where we'd spent countless hours dissecting cases and legal theories. Emma looked exactly the same sharp eyes, confident smile, legal pad already open and ready. Dave, Dad mentioned someone from the neighborhood is causing you problems. He seemed concerned. I nearly choked on my coffee. Concerned? He said Margaret Chen has been very persistent about some insurance fraud case. Calling his office, dropping by the house, really pushing for a harsh sentence. Emma's expression darkened. Dad doesn't like being pressured. Makes him suspicious. My heart started racing. Judge Morrison wasn't buying their sales pitch, he was questioning it. Emma, I need to tell you something. But first, can you promise me this conversation stays between us until I say otherwise? She nodded, and I laid out everything. The harassment, the fake violations, the manufactured evidence, the frame job. Emma listened without interruption, taking notes with the precision of the brilliant attorney she'd become. This is good, she said when I finished. This is really good. Good, Emma. They have photos, witnesses, video surveillance. They have a story, she corrected. But stories can be rewritten when you know how to read the subtext. She flipped to a fresh page. Let's start with what they don't know they gave you. First, their timeline is too perfect. Real criminals make mistakes. Their evidence reads like a checklist. But the photos show you complying with their violation notices. We can prove that with their own paperwork. Every gas can, every late-night cleaning session, every insurance, increase it all corresponds to their demands. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. Emma was right. Their strength was also their weakness. Second, she continued, Bob Harrison's surveillance video. They think it's their smoking gun, but security footage works both ways. What else did his cameras capture? HOA members coming and going? Late-night meetings? Suspicious activity from people who aren't you? My mind started racing. Margaret was at my property twice that week, doing inspections. Documented? She made me sign papers each time. Emma smiled. Beautiful. So we have proof she had access. Opportunity. And her husband works in construction, means, and knowledge too. But the real masterstroke came when Emma pulled out her laptop and showed me something that made my blood sing with vindication. HOA incorporation documents, financial records, development permits filed with the county. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Dave, they didn't just want your property. They needed it. Margaret and Frank Chen have been working with Pinnacle Development Corp for 18 months, planning a luxury condo complex. The documents were devastating. Contracts contingent on acquiring my lot. Profit projections in the millions. Bank loans secured against future development rights. This isn't just harassment, Emma breathed. This is organized fraud. They've been planning to steal your property from the beginning. Can you prove it in court? Better than that. She pulled up another screen. Frank Chen applied for construction permits 3 weeks before your cabin burned down. Permits specifically for the lot where your cabin stood. 3 weeks before. They'd been so certain of their frame job's success that they'd started the paperwork early. Emma, there's something else you need to know. I took a deep breath. Your father can't hear this case. He'll have to recuse himself because of our relationship. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Dave, you're not getting it. Dad doesn't have to recuse himself unless there's a direct conflict. You're not family. You're not a client. You're just someone who comes to barbecues. But the appearance of impropriety only exists if someone knows about our friendship. And nobody does except us. Her smile was razor sharp. Margaret thinks she bought herself a judge through dinner parties and donations. She has no idea she's been talking strategy with the defendant's best friend's daughter. The pieces clicked into place. Every conversation Margaret had with Judge Morrison, every attempt to influence his thinking, every confident prediction about the trial's outcome, it had all been filtered back to Emma and, through her, to me. They handed us their entire playbook, I whispered. Exactly. And now we're going to use it to destroy them. Emma closed her laptop with the finality of a closing argument. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to fight these charges publicly and loudly. Make them think you're desperate and flailing. While you do what? While I help you build the real case. Every piece of evidence they fabricated, every witness they coached, every document they falsified, we're going to prove it all. And when we do, Margaret Chen isn't just going to lose her insurance fraud case. She's going to face conspiracy charges herself. For the first time since that terrible morning in the ashes of my grandfather's cabin, I felt like myself again. Not a victim. Not a mark in someone else's con game. A fighter with the best weapon of all, the truth, backed by someone who knew exactly how to wield it. The courtroom felt like a gladiator arena the morning of my trial, with Margaret Chen sitting in the front row wearing the satisfied smile of someone who'd already counted her victory. Judge Morrison entered with his usual stern dignity, his eyes scanning the packed courtroom before settling briefly on me. For just a moment, I caught something that might have been sympathy, or maybe it was my imagination. The People versus David Sterling, he announced. Case number 2024, CR 1847. Insurance fraud and arson in the first degree. Dia Patricia Wells stood up like she was accepting an award. This was her showcase trial, her chance to prove how tough she was on white-collar crime. Her opening statement painted me as a calculating criminal who'd burned down my own property for money. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "the defendant thought he was clever. He thought he could manipulate the system, destroy evidence in a fire, and walk away with insurance money. But criminals always make mistakes." She presented their evidence with theatrical precision. The photos of me at the cabin. The gas can receipts. The insurance policy increase. Bob Harrison's security footage showing me working late into the night. "The timeline is clear," Wells declared. Financial desperation led to criminal planning, which led to arson and fraud. The defendant had means, motive, and opportunity. This is not a complex case. Margaret nodded approvingly from the gallery, probably already planning her victory celebration. Then my public defender, Sarah Kim, stood up for what everyone expected to be a weak, desperate defense. "Your Honor, my client didn't commit these crimes because he couldn't have committed these crimes. The prosecution's case is built on assumptions, coincidences, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the evidence." She seemed nervous, fumbling with her papers, not particularly confident. Margaret's smile widened. But then, Sarah did something unexpected. She called Emma Morrison to the stand. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." "Emma Morrison. I'm a property attorney with Morrison, Valdez and Associates." The courtroom stirred. Morrison. Same last name as the judge, but nobody connected the dots yet. "Mrs. Morrison, have you reviewed the HOA violation notices issued to my client?" "I have." Emma's voice was steady, professional. Over an 18-month period, Mr. Sterling received 47 separate citations, all for violations that occurred immediately after he attempted to comply with previous citations. "Can you give the jury an example?" "Certainly. Citation number 12 was for improper exterior paint color. Mr. Sterling repainted the cabin. Citation number 13, issued 3 days later, was for unauthorized exterior modifications for repainting the cabin." A murmur ran through the jury box. Sarah continued. "Mrs. Morrison, Did you discover any relationship between these violations and development plans in the area? Margaret's smile faltered. This wasn't part of their script. Emma pulled out a thick folder. I did. Margaret Chen and her husband Frank filed preliminary development permits for luxury condominiums on March 15, the 3 months before Mr. Sterling's cabin burned down. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. The permits specifically identified Mr. Sterling's property as necessary for acquisition, Emma continued. The development company had already secured financing contingent on obtaining his lot. Dia Wells shot to her feet. Objection. This is completely irrelevant too. Overruled, Judge Morrison said quietly. Continue, counselor. Sarah Kim was no longer fumbling with her papers. Mrs. Morrison, were you able to examine the security footage the prosecution has entered as evidence? I was. And I noticed something interesting about the timestamp. Emma activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's display system. Bob Harrison's security footage filled the screen, showing me working at the cabin that final night. The prosecution focuses on Mr. Sterling's presence at the property. But watch carefully at 11:47 p.m. The video showed a second vehicle pulling into the frame, just the edge of it, barely visible. Enhance that section, Emma said. The image zoomed and sharpened, revealing a partial license plate and the distinctive shape of a Lexus SUV. That's Margaret Chen's vehicle, Emma announced. She was at the property after Mr. Sterling left. Margaret went white. Bob Harrison looked like he'd been slapped. But there's more, Emma continued. Mr. Harrison's camera system records continuously. I subpoenaed the full footage from the week of the fire. Another video played, this one showing Margaret and Frank Chen at the cabin site 2 days after the fire, not investigating measuring. They're measuring lot boundaries for their construction project, Emma explained. 48 hours after a supposed crime, they're already planning their development. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression thunderous. This wasn't the case Margaret had described to him over dinner. Sarah Kim moved in for the kill. Mrs. Morrison, did your investigation reveal any other evidence of fraud in this case? Yes. The prosecution's key witnesses, all HOA board members, signed witness statements claiming they saw suspicious activity. But their own meeting minutes show they were all in an emergency HOA session from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. that night. They couldn't have witnessed anything. The jury was staring at Margaret now, and her confident smile had become a rictus of panic. Finally, Emma said, we have this. The final document filled the screen, Frank Chen's construction permit application, dated 3 weeks before the fire, complete with architectural plans for the exact lot where my cabin had stood. They were so confident their frame job would succeed, Emma concluded. They filed for construction permits before the crime was even committed. Judge Morrison's face was stone. Mrs. Wells, do you wish to redirect? The DA looked like she wanted to crawl under her table. No, Your Honor. As Emma walked past Margaret Chen's row, she made eye contact with the woman who tried to destroy my life. Some games, she said quietly, just loud enough for Margaret to hear, require knowing who you're really playing against. Margaret's confident expression had crumbled completely, replaced by the dawning realization that she'd been outmaneuvered by someone she never saw coming. The trial was far from over, but the war had just been won. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours, not guilty on all charges, but that was just the opening act of Margaret Chen's complete destruction. Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he addressed the courtroom. The court finds that this prosecution was based on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal conspiracy charges against the complainants. Margaret's face went ashen. Frank Chen looked like he might throw up. Bob Harrison was already edging toward the exit. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order prohibiting any member of the Pinewood Hills HOA board from contacting Mr. Sterling or his property. This court will not tolerate attempts to criminally harass citizens over property disputes. The gavel came down like a thunderclap, and suddenly I was free. More than free, I was vindicated. The media circus that followed was everything Margaret had planned for me, turned back on her with devastating precision. The same reporters who'd covered my insurance fraud scheme now had a much juicier story. HOA board accused of framing property owner. Channel 7's investigative team descended on Pinewood Hills like locusts. Within 48 hours, they'd uncovered a pattern of corruption that made my case look like practice. We've discovered at least 6 other property owners who report similar harassment from this HOA board, announced reporter Jessica Martinez, all involving properties that coincidentally sit on land planned for development by companies connected to board members. The dam burst completely when Bob Harrison, facing his own criminal charges, decided to save himself by cooperating with prosecutors. His confession was a masterpiece of cowardice and detail. Margaret orchestrated the whole thing, he admitted in a recorded statement that leaked to every local news outlet. She had us document everything David did for months, then coached us on what to say in our witness statements. The fire. We didn't start it, but when it happened naturally, she saw her opportunity. Naturally, that single word vindicated everything I'd believed about the fire. It had been an accident, old wiring in my grandfather's cabin, exacerbated by the excessive cleaning chemicals I'd been forced to use for their ridiculous inspections. Margaret had simply seized on a tragedy and weaponized it. The criminal charges came down like dominoes. Margaret and Frank Chen were arrested on conspiracy, fraud, and perjury charges. Patricia Wong and Sandra Mills were charged as accessories. Bob Harrison got a plea deal for his cooperation, but still faced jail time. But the real satisfaction came when their entire development scheme collapsed. Pinnacle Development Corp. Pulled out of their contracts the moment the scandal broke. The luxury condos would never be built. The millions in projected profits evaporated overnight. Margaret's arrogance had destroyed everything she'd worked for. The civil lawsuits started immediately. I sued the HOA Margaret personally and Bob Harrison for defamation, false imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Emma helped me find the best civil attorney in the state, and the case was so strong that they settled out of court for more money than my grandfather's cabin had ever been worth. But Margaret couldn't let go. Even facing criminal charges, even with her reputation in ruins, she tried one final desperate play. She hired a private investigator to look into my relationship with Emma Morrison, hoping to find some ethical violation that could invalidate the trial. When that failed, she started spreading rumors that I'd bribed witnesses and fabricated evidence. The community's response was swift and brutal. A group of homeowners filed a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. Property owners who'd been quietly suffering under Margaret's tyranny came forward with their own stories of harassment and corruption. She fined me $3,000 for having the wrong mailbox, testified elderly resident Helen Rodriguez. When I couldn't pay, she threatened to put a line on my house. A house I've owned for 30 years. The final blow came when the State Attorney General's office announced a comprehensive investigation into HOA corruption statewide, using Margaret's case as the template for identifying similar schemes. Margaret Chen, who had once controlled an entire neighborhood through fear and bureaucratic manipulation, was now facing 15 years in federal prison. Her husband, Frank, lost his construction license. Their development company went bankrupt. Their house, the same house where they'd entertained Judge Morrison and plotted my destruction, went into foreclosure. The woman who'd tried to destroy my life over a piece of property had lost everything she'd ever worked for. But even then, she couldn't accept defeat. From her jail cell awaiting trial, she sent me one final letter through her attorney. You think you've won, but you'll never rebuild what was lost. Your grandfather's legacy is still gone. She was wrong about that too. Because while Margaret rotted in legal hell, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making, I was already drawing up plans for something she'd never understood and could never destroy. Not just a cabin. Not just a property. A real legacy, built on truth instead of lies, justice instead of corruption, and relationships that mattered more than money or power. Margaret had taught me something valuable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting better. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours. Not guilty on all charges, but that was just the opening act of Margaret Chen's complete destruction. Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he addressed the courtroom. The court finds that this prosecution was based on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal conspiracy charges against the complainants. Margaret's face went ashen. Frank Chen looked like he might throw up. Bob Harrison was already edging toward the exit. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order prohibiting any member of the Pinewood Hills HOA board from contacting Mr. Sterling or his property. This court will not tolerate attempts to criminally harass citizens over property disputes. The gavel came down like a thunderclap, and suddenly I was free. More than free, I was vindicated. The media circus that followed was everything Margaret had planned for me, turned back on her with devastating precision. The same reporters who'd covered my insurance fraud scheme now had a much juicier story. HOA board accused of framing property owner. Channel 7's investigative team descended on Pinewood Hills like locusts. Within 48 hours, they'd uncovered a pattern of corruption that made my case look like practice. We've discovered at least 6 other property owners who report similar harassment from this HOA board, announced reporter Jessica Martinez. All involving properties that coincidentally sit on land planned for development by companies connected to board members. The dam burst completely when Bob Harrison, facing his own criminal charges, decided to save himself by cooperating with prosecutors. His confession was a masterpiece of cowardice and detail. Margaret orchestrated the whole thing, he admitted in a recorded statement that leaked to every local news outlet. She had us document everything David did for months, then coached us on what to say in our witness statements. The fire. We didn't start it, but when it happened naturally, she saw her opportunity. Naturally, that single word vindicated everything I'd believed about the fire. It had been an accident, old wiring in my grandfather's cabin, exacerbated by the excessive cleaning chemicals I'd been forced to use for their ridiculous inspections. Margaret had simply seized on a tragedy and weaponized it. The criminal charges came down like dominoes. Margaret and Frank Chen were arrested on conspiracy, fraud, and perjury charges. Patricia Wong and Sandra Mills were charged as accessories. Bob Harrison got a plea deal for his cooperation, but still faced jail time. But the real satisfaction came when their entire development scheme collapsed. Pinnacle Development Corp pulled out of their contracts the moment the scandal broke. The luxury condos would never be built. The millions in projected profits evaporated overnight. Margaret's arrogance had destroyed everything she'd worked for. The civil lawsuits started immediately. I sued the HOA, Margaret personally, and Bob Harrison for defamation, false imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Emma helped me find the best civil attorney in the state, and the case was so strong that they settled out of court for more money than my grandfather's cabin had ever been worth. But Margaret couldn't let go. Even facing criminal charges, even with her reputation in ruins, she tried one final desperate play. She hired a private investigator to look into my relationship with Emma Morrison, hoping to find some ethical violation that could invalidate the trial. When that failed, she started spreading rumors that I'd bribed witnesses and fabricated evidence. The community's response was swift and brutal. A group of homeowners filed a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. Property owners who'd been quietly suffering under Margaret's tyranny came forward with their own stories of harassment and corruption. She fined me $3,000 for having the wrong mailbox, testified elderly resident Helen Rodriguez. When I couldn't pay, she threatened to put a lion on my house. A house I've owned for 30 years. The final blow came when the State Attorney General's office announced a comprehensive investigation into HOA corruption statewide, using Margaret's case as the template for identifying similar schemes. Margaret Chen, who'd once controlled an entire neighborhood through fear and bureaucratic manipulation, was now facing 15 years in federal prison. Her husband Frank lost his construction license. Their development company went bankrupt. Their house, the same house where they'd entertained Judge Morrison and plotted my destruction, went into foreclosure. The woman who'd tried to destroy my life over a piece of property had lost everything she'd ever worked for. But even then, she couldn't accept defeat. From her jail cell awaiting trial, she sent me one final letter through her attorney. "You think you've won, but you'll never rebuild what was lost. Your grandfather's legacy is still gone." She was wrong about that too. Because while Margaret rotted in legal hell, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making, I was already drawing up plans for something she'd never understood and could never destroy. Not just a cabin. Not just a property. A real legacy built on truth instead of lies, justice instead of corruption, and relationships that mattered more than money or power. Margaret had taught me something valuable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting better.